everybody. Taking some time, letting people join us. If you're here and you've got a question, drop it in the chat. I'll answer your questions while I sip on my seltzer. How was everybody's day? Did you see the hailstorm and the thunderstorm? Because that's super normal March weather. Yeah, right now I'm hanging out. I'm still working, so I worked all day today. Had a lot of Zoom meetings, spending a lot of time on Zoom. I imagine everyone else is doing the same. Then right now, Bill's making some dinner, but he ran away. I think he's just making a pizza. We haven't been eating as healthy and as much as we probably should be. So frozen pizza is where it's at right now. Hey Emma. I am doing okay with social distancing. I've been spending a lot of time inside, probably more than I would like, but it's been okay. Bill and I are still trying to take walks around our neighborhood at least, although we did make the mistake maybe Thursday last week. It was really nice out and we went down to the river, which is right by our house. Way too many people. Don't go toward the river. There were way too many people out. Made me very uncomfortable, and I think it just made me more stressed than actually relieving stress. So that was not the best choice. And yeah, otherwise we're good. We look out. We're both able to work from home, so that makes it easy on us. But yeah, like I said, I've been spending a lot of time on Zoom, getting dressed from the waist up. Though, Kirsten wants to know what kind of pizza. Good question. It looks like a margarita, a frozen margarita pizza. Ideally, what you would do is you would saute spinach and garlic and then throw that on top once it's cooked, but we don't. I don't think I have any fresh spinach right now because my fridge actually died this week or last week, and so keeping vegetables fresh right now is kind of hard, which is less than ideal. It's kind of like one of those things. Everything happens at once. How's everybody else doing with social distancing? I've seen people doing this thing where they're social distancing, but they're doing it together. And then I read that that actually isn't social distancing. Like hanging out with your friends 6 feet away doesn't count. You're really not supposed to be hanging out with people, just as an FYI. I also read that you really probably 6 feet is still kind of close, and you probably want to be even further away than that. So I did see some of my neighbors kind of just put up a bunch of chairs and were hanging out together in a driveway this weekend, and apparently that's really not social distancing. You really should be trying to avoid contact with people you don't live with as much as possible, and if you have to be in contact or near someone, that's when you're trying to keep at least 6 feet away. Will says hi. Hey Will. Hey Joanna. What else is going on? Did anybody phone bank this weekend? Anyone? I did. Did on Saturday and I did on Sunday. And actually on Saturday, I talked to a woman who, we've been phone banking and we've been asking people how they're doing through this pandemic, really trying to start the conversation with that, just to make sure people are okay and that we're not being oblivious to what's actually going on in the world for people right now. And a woman that I talked to mentioned that she is a bartender, so she's no longer working. Her partner luckily still is able to work right now, but she said that she's got a few young kids and wasn't able to find any cleaning supplies or any soap or hand sanitizer. So I luckily had some cleaning supplies in left over in my stock at my house, and then when I went grocery shopping on Sunday, I found some soap for her and I dropped that off at her house on Sunday. So I think she was pretty appreciative of that, and I think a lot of us have been trying to do more of that, actually finding ways that we can help each other out. I think a lot of people have learned the phrase mutual aid for the first time of how do we rely on each other for our communities to be able to take care of each other, which is awesome to see that people are doing it. Obviously, I wish they didn't have to. I wish that there were that we weren't reacting in a crisis and that we were actually able to have supports in place before this. But in absence of that, it's always good to see people taking care of each other. What else do you guys want to know? Bill's here now. Say hey, Bill.
Hey.
No, like, come and say hi. Okay, he's hiding. What up? Bill, do you have a question?
What time is it?
7:36 Eastern.
Okay.
Joanna says hey. All right, what else is going on? I'm still pretty concerned about people being able to pay rent and bills in, what are we down to, 2 days now? I know that we did pass the CARES Act that extends unemployment, grants a $1,200 payment to a lot of people, includes some other provisions to increase SNAP benefits and some housing benefits. But we know that those things aren't getting to people immediately. So I'm still pretty concerned about the fact that we don't have a rent and mortgage and loan payment moratorium in place right now. I think that while it's good that our governor has made the decision to prevent evictions and foreclosures, which is that's a great step. I'm not discrediting it by any means, because to have people be evicted right now would be absolutely horrific. But I think what I'm concerned about is the fact that payments are still technically due. So even though you can't start eviction proceedings against someone right now, you can basically, as soon as the state of emergency is rescinded, you have 31 days, and then you can go after someone for eviction or foreclosure. So if there are people who are going to be unable to pay those bills over the next however many months, they're essentially going to have 31 days to be able to catch up. And I think for a lot of people who aren't able to pay the bill during this state of emergency and during this crisis, I don't know how 31 days after it is really going to make a difference for them. So I'm pretty concerned about that for people. And still trying to push for a moratorium on those payments. Hasn't happened yet, but hopefully we can continue to make some noise about that. Has Delaware done a rent freeze? No, that's what we were just talking about. Sorry, I just saw the comment from Emma. I hope that it might come in May. I think that it feels unlikely to happen now between, right now and the 1st in 2 days, but I don't think that's a reason to give up on it, because, like I said, I am really concerned about the fact that this will essentially just push a bunch of evictions to 3 months from now or 2 months from now, whenever this state of emergency ends. So it's not necessarily giving anybody any relief. It's just delaying the effects. And I actually, again, phone banking a woman yesterday who said that she received an eviction notice in the beginning of March, and we were talking about that, and I was trying to inform her that, okay, during the state of emergency, you can't be evicted, but according to what I read on the state website, if you had already received an eviction notice, you can't be evicted during this emergency, but that period is only 7 days after the state of emergency is received. So if you've already received a notice, there's only a 7-day window after the state of emergency is lifted. So she's really in a place right now where she's concerned that she's not going to be able to find another place to live. And she's particularly concerned because she has lived in this place for, I think she said, like over 5 years, and has paid her rent on time and is really being evicted because her landlord wants to try to sell. So she's in a place where she's facing housing instability, not for her own, fault, but because her landlord is deciding that they want to get rid of the house. And so that obviously changed into a conversation about how rent control is really important, because right now she's struggling to find a place that she could even afford, how tenants' bills of rights are incredibly important so that tenants have more power and in the relationship with landlords, because right now it's pretty one-sided and most renters feel like they have no control over their housing. So Benjamin was asking how we can put pressure on the governor to do a rent freeze. So there is a petition that's out there right now. It's a change.org petition that actually wasn't started by us, but we've been sharing it. So that's one thing. Add your name to that petition if you can. I would also reach out and make phone calls to the governor's office. Maybe that's something we could actually put a script together around for people, but mostly I would make the point to them that yes, eviction and foreclosure moratoriums are awesome. Thank you for doing that. However, I'm concerned that we're basically just pushing the problem down the line, and we're going to run into people getting kicked out of their homes right after the state of emergency is over rather than during, which is really not any better. So I think making phone calls to the governor's office and sending emails is one way to put pressure to see that change. Johnny said, "Is this a good time to talk about ideals and policies?" Sure. Let's hear those questions, Johnny. Yeah, so Kenny's asking about Green New Deal and whether you can elaborate on it. Totally. So Green New Deal right now is really a proposal that's been put forward of a vision for tackling climate change. And it's not necessarily even detailed. There's not a big, these bills come out and they're hundreds and hundreds of pages. Like, that's not where it's at. It's really more about we want to make this commitment to say that we want to change the way our country functions from a climate standpoint. It is a agreement, essentially, that we would sign and agree to and say we are committing to, primarily the things you would be committing to are completely ending our dependence on fossil fuels. So we know that there have been quite a few scientific studies that say we're really at a point where we've got 10 to 15 years to completely end carbon emissions. Otherwise, we're really getting to a place where the worldwide temperature is going to be raised too high, and we're going to see effects beyond what we're even seeing already that will be, frankly, really difficult to undo. So the Green New Deal would be our commitment to say we are going to do what science says we have to do, and we're going to end our dependence on fossil fuels. It would mean that we end any new drilling. It would mean that and that's oil, that's natural gas, that's anything that is a fossil fuel, it's coal, and we would be working toward moving to fully renewable energy. So investing really heavily in solar and in wind and in other renewable energy sources that don't create the emissions that our fossil fuels currently do. And the piece of it that's, I think, particularly interesting and why it's such a massive change is that we're really saying we're going to remake all of the infrastructure of our country. There was a period where we committed to building the highway systems that we have right now. And it was a multi-year effort. It took many, many dollars. It took many, many jobs and work. It created many jobs and took a lot of work. And we're talking about like that level of infrastructure investment where we say we're going to do that level of investment in public transportation, in high-speed rail, in the things that will allow people to get out of their cars, which we're really reliant on right now, and get people off the roads and get them into more public transit that is run on renewable energy. And I talked about jobs there. It's also a commitment to saying that we would create a federal jobs guarantee within that program so that whoever needed a job is able to raise their hand and go to the federal government and say, I want to participate and be part of bringing this Green New Deal to life. And they would be able to apply for a job within that program. And what's interesting about that is that it also, if we had that right now, how many people who just lost their jobs would be in a better position? It creates the ability for people to raise their hand and say, I'm not finding a job elsewhere in the private sector. I want to participate in this program, and it ensures that people are able to keep living a dignified standard of living. We could definitely go into that more, but I think those are kind of the crucial highlights to me, is that it's really all about ending fossil fuel dependence, rebuilding our infrastructure, and that extends to like buildings and schools and all the public buildings that we own, like making sure that they are more efficient and as well as resilient against the climate change that we know we're going to face already and frankly are already facing. Yeah. All right. Joe is asking a question about a few homeless people have been housed in motels. What about the remaining folks? Which is, I think, a really good question. I've asked that question, and I did hear there was a Q&A done with the governor today with Delaware Online, and it sounded like he talked about that program a little bit more and what the state's trying to do by reaching out to people people who are there where are homeless currently and trying to get them housed. I don't know how effective it's been to this point. That is something that I'm certainly concerned about, and I've kind of asked them to address that in these Q&As that they've been doing, because we know that our hotels and our motels are sitting empty right now. There's rooms that we could be housing people in and making sure that they have access to not just a roof over their head, but also a shower and a bathroom, because while we have put out washing stations and porta potties for people who are homeless, and I know that's happened at least in the city of Wilmington, I'm not sure how much it's happened elsewhere in the state, but that's still not housing, and that's still not acceptable when you tell people when you issue a shelter in place and stay at home order for the entire state, yet we know we have thousands of people who don't have housing. We really should be making sure that we are providing it to them. So I don't know exactly what is being done, other than I know they have made an effort and they've tried to make contact with people that they know are homeless and places that they know homeless people may be spending their time. But I don't think it's extended to every single person just yet. Will asks, how can someone with a Senate seat use it for functions outside of its traditional purview, such as activism? I think that's a super good question, and it's something that I actually really enjoy talking to people about, because I think so many people feel disconnected from their government and from politics as a whole because it hasn't been participatory. And I think that's actually, I have a different perspective on how that should be. I think that we should be trying to do what people refer to as like an inside-outside strategy of getting people in the seats that share our values, but making sure that they stay connected to organizers and activists on the ground that are seeing firsthand what people are going through and what they're experiencing and are doing the work to try to improve their lives. So I think that is one way I would use the power of that seat differently than our current representation is. Making sure that I'm still talking to the people who are back home in the state and staying connected to them and staying connected to the problems that people are facing is incredibly important. I also think that you should be using that power to get like-minded people elected, and we haven't seen that much of that either. But I think that if you are able to say, okay, we're in this seat now, we've gained this power, how do we use that to then also push for other people in other states or our other Senate seat to get someone who shares our values? Because I think that we know there aren't that many progressives in the Senate right now, and adding one is great, but we know we're going to have to keep building that power. So how can you use the seat that you have and the platform that you'll have from that seat to bring someone else along and find the next person the next seat you can flip, or the next person that you can bring along? And I think it also can be used. There's like a great story about Bernie Sanders. I think it was in the 90s, and like IBM was basically trying to like take away all the pensions of the people who were retiring, and Bernie found the senator in a state where there was another large group of IBM employees, and basically everybody band together. So it was like him and a couple other senators from different states actually pressuring IBM to not cut those pensions. And that's, I think, another thing that we see so little of right now is like, because senators are not necessarily connected to the issues that people are facing at home, they're not using the power that they have maybe as effectively as they could to prevent things like that from happening. And when you have the opportunity to do it across states and come together and do that work together, I think that's how you get even more power against a corporation or whoever it is that you're trying to activate people against. Okay. Johnny says, I saw some actions ICE has been doing with pretending to be doctors to get into people's homes. Jesus. I have not heard that, and that's horrific. I was wondering what your view on ICE was. So I am of the mind that ICE was a mistake, like many of the things that we did after 9/11. I think it's important to remind people that that's how young that agency is. It is not some traditional entity that we have had for the life of our country. It is relatively new, and that doesn't we should not feel like we have to retain it. I think that it should be abolished, and we should not have a militarized police force that goes around apparently lying to people about who they are and who their identity is in an attempt to round people up and deport them. Um, I think that we should be frankly ashamed of that agency and its behavior, particularly over the last 3-4 years, and we really need to undo that harm and get rid of it. All right. Says, a big part of the economic and social issues that we have as a society stem from global system of trade and finance that prevent progress on creating international standards to fight climate change and giving workers sustainable sources of power. So when talking specifically about the role that trade agreements play in this, what kind of steps would you take to make existing and future agreements better? This is a very good question. I think one of the biggest failures of the current USMCA, that was like just new NAFTA, signed at the end of last year, early this year, time is lately. The biggest issue with that for me is that it completely failed to acknowledge that climate change exists. I would not sign a trade agreement that is unaware of climate change. I think that if we are going to be executing trade agreements, they should require the countries who are signing onto them to make changes and address climate change. Because we know, to your point, that climate change is not necessarily coming from the personal decisions that we are making as people, right? It is predominantly coming from the corporations that are the fossil fuel companies, and the fact that there are banks that are investing in those fossil fuel projects. So why would we not be using the power of something like a trade agreement to institute standards and to hold people to those standards to actually make change on what I believe is the biggest, in the moment, coronavirus, biggest crisis we're facing, but right behind it is climate change, and that's not going away. I think in a lot of ways, coronavirus is, we're seeing, it's almost as if climate change was happening all at once, and I think that level of crisis is like how we should be reacting to climate change, because climate change is happening slowly. We're not getting that response out of people. But trade agreements are absolutely a tool that we should be using to do that. I think the other problem I had with USMCA and the issue that most people had with NAFTA is that the worker, the ability to enforce the worker standards, I'm pretty concerned about. So while they were strengthened, the ability to actually enforce them is not there. And I think that happens a lot with bills that end up getting passed into law. I think that's another example of what just happened with this bill in response to coronavirus. Is there are some guidelines around how, for example, corporate bailout money can be used and the standards that those companies are supposed to adhere to, but the enforceability of it is really weak. And those are the types of things that I would be looking to change and make sure that if we are doing these things, we actually are putting controls in place, not just sort of gesturing towards control. Sorry, everybody. I'm also getting text while this is happening, which makes it a little challenging to feel, to field. Okay. Being a progressive comes with some inevitable conflicts with leadership, as we've seen with the squad. How would you handle those potential disagreements? That's a tough one. I mean, it's tough to answer in hypothetical, I think. I think it really comes down to like what is it that we're talking about. I think it's maybe recency effect, but talking about this CARES Act, this bill in response to coronavirus, I'm pretty disappointed with what was in it from the standpoint of the support that it actually gives workers. when you look at taking $500 billion to and giving it to the Fed so that they can leverage it into trillions of dollars to provide money to corporations. What I would have liked to see is more um, let's let's support payroll and keep workers employed and commit to paying their salaries rather than handing corporations money that they can basically choose to use how they want to with very limited restrictions. And they can still lay workers off. They just have to hold on to them for like 6 months. So I think that is an example of something that, like, I don't necessarily agree with it, but I think that I probably still would have voted for it, given that we still need to get money in people's hands. But I think that's a place where the fight would have been much more about how do we continue to push back on this piece that we are putting so much money into corporations. I don't think corporations should be the tool by which we get money into people's hands in a crisis like this. So I think, that's one example of, I probably would have disagreed, but I think in this case it's better to take the action that we had on the table, unfortunately, though it wasn't as great as I would have liked it to be. I think the other piece is really like, how do you engage voters back home and people across different states or different places to help them have the language they need or to take the actions they need to influence other senators. So I think that's another way that you can kind of use the power and the platform that you have to engage people. Because I think most of these things that I imagine that I would have disagreements with leadership on are going to take political will. They can't just be fights that we're having behind closed doors. It really has to be like, how do we bring people in? Because I don't think a lot of the things that we need are going to change until there is this groundswell of activity and demand for action. So I think that's one way that we could be handling those disagreements, is saying like, okay, like, I think a lot of people in our government currently are looking for, there's a lot of people who kind of watch the polls or the tides and react that way, rather than saying like, this aligns with my values and this aligns with my views, so I'm going to make this decision and lead on it. I think a lot of people are reactionary to what they see people wanting. So how can we get that political will built up outside of the Senate, outside of the House, so that those people who do need to see that those winds change, see it happening? Okay, what's the difference between your progressive platform and existing Delaware representatives? I think I've been touching on it a bit here. I think one of the biggest things is the fact that I am not taking any corporate PAC money, any corporate donation money. And the reason for that is because I don't want to be beholden to corporations or corporate lobbyists when I am in that seat. I want to be legislating in favor of people and not in favor of the profits of corporations. And right now, we have a senator who takes millions of dollars in donations from corporations, particularly the pharmaceutical industry and healthcare industry, particularly, sounds weird, but chicken processing industry, given the amount of that business that happens in our state. And we can see the direct connections to how he legislates in favor of those companies. Banks are another one, where taking a ton of money from banks, Senator Coons has voted to roll back protections that were put in place after the last recession in Dodd-Frank, and making it easier for banks to frankly discriminate in their lending practices, and leaving that law in a place where it really only applies to 12 banks in our entire country now. Another example is with those chicken processing plants, taking thousands and thousands of dollars from them and then legislating in favor to allow them to no longer have to report their emissions. These are the same plants that are literally poisoning people downstate right now, and we have people whose wells are completely undrinkable because of the emissions that come from those plants. And same thing goes for the pharmaceutical industry. He receives the second most amount of money from the pharmaceutical industry, just behind Mitch McConnell, is the only person who beats him, and is currently working on a bill to allow pharmaceutical companies to strengthen their patents allowing them to potentially patent things that even aren't even inventions, like potentially patent genetic code and keep their profits for longer. I think that is one of the core differences. I think another one is the fact that for as much as the senator will say he opposes Donald Trump, he has also worked to facilitate his agenda by voting to confirm dozens and dozens, more than 80 of the judges that Trump has appointed to the judiciary, which really remakes the judiciary for the rest of my life. These are lifetime appointments, and there are people now sitting in those seats who are more ideological and don't uphold precedent of Supreme Court decisions and other federal law decisions that will open up the challenges to things like women's rights, to civil rights. I mean, we're talking about things like not necessarily agreeing with the ruling of Brown versus Board of Education. And when I see the senator confirm people like that to the judiciary, when I see him fight to confirm our current Health and Human Services Secretary, Alex Azar, who has completely failed to lead through this pandemic, I really question how he can say he stands against Trump's agenda when he's really allowing Trump to put people in place that are harming our country. Okay. So Dennis Williams is asking about giving Republicans what they want and how much corporate bailout will be in the next stimulus bill. I totally agree. I think that what should have happened was, I think at the very least, the conversation that came out after the bill was really frustrating. When people are touting that this is like a bipartisan success, you are not holding Republicans' feet to the flame. You're basically saying, glad we agreed to this, rather than saying what was actually happening is that there were a ton of Republicans who were trying to cut the generosity of the unemployment benefits that we're getting. There were a ton of Republicans who decided that $1,200 was going to be enough. And I think it really comes down to like, how can we talk about these things and make it clear to people and break it down to people what's actually happening. And I don't know that we're getting that right now. When you prioritize bipartisanship and compromise and getting along and quote unquote getting things done, I think that's the wrong prioritization, because I would rather be focused on what are you actually getting done. I don't think this bill is great. I think the fact that it has these corporate bailouts in it is completely unnecessary. The fact that, particularly when you look at some of the industries or the money that's going to, let's say, Boeing, who, when people were talking about, okay, if you want a bailout, we want equity in your company, and the CEO is saying, well, if it comes with those strings, then I don't want it. We took away the strings and we still gave him the money. And those are the types of things that I think we have to be really vocal about and be clearer to people, to actually point to why things are this way, rather than walking away from what is a not great bill and then saying, this is a success, we should be proud of getting money in people's hands. I think that's the wrong message to come out of this with. I think the message should have been like, I'm not happy with this. I want to get this in your hands, but here's the reasons why this was bad. I think that when we allow ourselves to be put in a rock and a hard place, like by not proposing our own legislation, by not proposing in the House, for example, the most progressive thing that we could have done and handed it to the Senate and said like, no, pass this. When we already say like, okay, when we put forward means-tested programs and we say, how do we make sure that people who don't deserve this don't get it? We're starting from a position of, frankly, weakness and a position of compromise before we've even gotten to the negotiating table. And that's something that I find incredibly frustrating, and I'd much rather see, as Democrats, us coming to the table with the things that are going to center people as much as possible and force the other side to say no. And be really clear and message and vocal and use our platforms to tell people what those conversations were. When we go, I think we really do harm when we go behind closed doors and we say we came to a decision, because it doesn't do a good enough job of telling people like, this is not what I wanted. And I think that's something that I think some of the more progressive members of Congress now are doing a really good job of, and we should continue doing more of. Okay, question from Evan B. I'm losing things. Losing track here. Political signing positions, you see that voters are more aware of fraudulence, or there's an ongoing struggle when you speak to primary voters. Okay, so the question was, Democrats in Delaware have been able to pose as progressives by having a few liberal-sounding positions. Do you see that voters are more aware of fraudulence, or is it an ongoing struggle when you speak to primary voters? That's a good question. I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about things in the spectrum of political views. They're not necessarily plotting themselves all the time on like, here's where my ideology is. I think sometimes those of us who are like a little more plugged in have a little bit more strict views on ideology, but I think the majority of people I talk to don't necessarily think that way. I think what they do think about is like the problems that they're facing in their life, what's going on with their family, what happens at the end of the month when they have bills due. And I think speaking specifically to those problems that they face and talking about how we can actually use politics and government to truly make people's lives better is actually what resonates with people. And it doesn't necessarily have to be about like, this is progressive, this is conservative, this is labeled. I think I try to mostly have that conversation more about like, what are you facing in your life? And let's talk about the ways that we can actually use the power of the government to make that better. I've had that conversation with people who identify themselves as Republicans, who I think if I went in saying like, this is a progressive left position, that would shut the conversation down. I think it's much more effective to talk about like what's actually going on in people's lives and tie back to what is the actual cause of that problem. I think that's incredibly important, like pointing out to people that things aren't this way because of things that you've done. They're this way because of the system that we're operating in. But here's the changes that we can try to make together to actually improve those conditions. And I have that conversation a lot about being like, how do we actually fight for these things together? And I think that's kind of been a theme of some of the things I've said here. Because this isn't about just electing a single person. It's about completely changing the way that we try to engage with politics and making it much more accessible to people and something that people participate in rather than something that people feel excluded from. So I think that what people seem to react to best is someone who can speak really directly to what they're facing every day and help propose solutions that would actually change that and tell them how they can actually get involved to make that change happen. Okay. Well, it's after 8, so I'm going to wrap it up. But if you want to get involved, want to learn more, the best way to do that is to go to our website at justfordelaware.com. You can donate there, you can sign up to volunteer, which please do today if you want to get involved. If you're not already involved, we have a weekly new team member meeting, which will happen on Wednesday. So if you sign up today, you can get involved with that this week, and we'll get you off and running and helping us vote bank. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye.